Millfield, Alabama, September 14, 1978. The scent of freshly baked cornbread still lingered in Martha Calloway's kitchen when her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, knocked on the screen door for the third time that evening. Through the mesh, she could see the empty driveway where Tommy's blue Chevrolet pickup should have been parked, its chrome bumper catching the last rays of Alabama sunlight. Tommy Calloway was supposed to be home by 6:30. It was now past 9, and the meatloaf Martha had prepared sat cold on the dining table, covered with aluminum foil that reflected the amber glow of the table lamp. The ice in his sweet tea had long since melted, leaving rings of condensation on the wooden surface his grandfather had crafted decades earlier. At 24, Tommy worked as a mechanic at Briggs Auto Repair on Highway 31, just outside Millfield's city limits. Every weekday for the past 3 years, he'd followed the same routine: clock out at 5:15, stop by Miller's Grocery for cigarettes and a Coca-Cola, then drive the winding back roads home to the small house he shared with Martha, his wife of 2 years. But this Thursday evening felt different. The September air carried an unusual heaviness, and the cicadas seemed quieter than normal. Martha had spent the afternoon canning peaches from their backyard tree, and the kitchen windows were still fogged from the steam. She'd planned to surprise Tommy with fresh peach cobbler after dinner. Maybe he stopped by his daddy's place to help with the tobacco harvest, Mrs. Henderson suggested, though her voice carried doubt. Everyone in Millfield knew that Tommy and his father, Earl Calloway, had barely spoken since Tommy married Martha against the old man's wishes. Martha pressed her face against the cool glass of the front window, searching the empty road for headlights. The street lamp at the corner flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows across the front yard, where Tommy's hunting dog, Rex, lay unusually still. Even the dog seemed to sense something was wrong. By 10 o'clock, Martha had called Briggs Auto Repair twice, but the phone rang unanswered. She'd also tried the hardware store, the diner on Main Street, and even the pool hall where Tommy occasionally met his high school friends for a beer. Nobody had seen him since he'd left work. The last person to see Tommy Calloway was his co-worker, Dale Morrison, who watched him climb into his pickup truck in the auto shop's gravel parking lot. Dale later told police that Tommy had seemed normal, maybe a little tired, but nothing unusual. He'd waved goodbye and driven south toward town, just like every other day. What Dale didn't mention until much later was the conversation he'd overheard earlier that afternoon between Tommy and a stranger who'd stopped by the shop. The man had asked specific questions about Tommy's schedule, when he usually left work and which route he took home. At the time, Dale assumed it was someone looking to have their car repaired, but thinking back, the man never mentioned any vehicle troubles. As midnight approached, Martha finally called the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department. Deputy Frank Weston assured her that young men sometimes needed to blow off steam, especially after a long week of work. He promised to keep an eye out for Tommy's truck during his patrol, but his tone suggested he wasn't particularly concerned. Martha spent that first night sitting in the living room, watching through the window and listening for the familiar rumble of Tommy's engine. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed every hour, each sound echoing through the house like a countdown to something she couldn't yet understand. When dawn broke over Millfield on September 15, 1978, Tommy Calloway had been missing for 14 hours. His truck was nowhere to be found, and nobody in their small community of 3,200 people had any idea where he might have gone. The morning dew on Martha's front lawn would be the last time nature looked quite the same in Millfield. Something had shifted in their quiet corner of Alabama, and though nobody could name it yet, everyone could feel it in the air. Millfield, Alabama, September 1978 to December 1979. By the third day, even Deputy Weston couldn't ignore the growing concern that rippled through Millfield like stones thrown into still water. Martha's sister, Carol, had driven down from Birmingham, and together they'd organized a search party that included nearly half the town's adult population. The volunteers gathered at dawn in the parking lot of Millfield Baptist Church, their breath visible in the cool morning air. Reverend Hayes offered a prayer before the group spread out across the rural countryside, walking through tobacco fields, checking abandoned barns, and calling Tommy's name until their voices grew hoarse. Old Mr. Garrett, who owned the largest farm in the county, provided his hunting dogs to help with the search. The bloodhounds picked up Tommy's scent from clothes Martha had given them, but the trail went cold at the intersection of Highway 31 and Morse Road, exactly where Dale Morrison said he'd seen Tommy turn toward home. Sheriff Robert Coleman finally arrived from the county seat on the fourth day, bringing with him a state trooper, and a more serious attitude toward the investigation. They interviewed everyone who knew Tommy, starting with his family and expanding outward through his network of friends, co-workers, and acquaintances. The interviews revealed a picture of a well-liked young man with no enemies and no obvious reasons to disappear. Tommy didn't gamble, rarely drank more than a beer or two, and had never been in trouble with the law. His marriage to Martha appeared solid, though some mentioned the ongoing tension with his father over family land that Earl Calloway had refused to divide among his sons. Tommy was planning to buy that little plot behind the Methodist church, Martha told Sheriff Coleman during her interview. He'd been saving money for months, talking about building us a bigger house there. He was excited about the future, not running from it. But as weeks turned into months, the initial urgency began to fade. The sheriff's department had few leads to follow, and other cases demanded their attention. The FBI was contacted, but showed little interest in what appeared to be a missing adult with no evidence of foul play. Martha struggled to maintain hope while managing the practical challenges of Tommy's absence. His paycheck stopped coming, and she took a job at the textile mill in nearby Gardendale to pay the mortgage. The house felt enormous and empty, every creak and settling sound making her heart race with the possibility that Tommy had finally come home. The community's support, while genuine, came with an undercurrent of whispered speculation. Some suggested Tommy had another woman somewhere and had simply chosen to start over. Others wondered if he'd gotten involved with the wrong people. There were rumors of illegal gambling operations in the next county, and stories of young men who'd borrowed money they couldn't repay. Mrs. Henderson, despite her loyalty to Martha, couldn't help but share her theory with other neighbors. Men don't just vanish without a reason, she'd say, while hanging laundry on her backyard line. There's always something we don't know about. By Christmas of 1978, the search efforts had essentially stopped. Tommy's case file gathered dust in Sheriff Coleman's office, occasionally reviewed when similar missing person reports came in, but never advancing toward any real resolution. Martha's family urged her to consider moving back to Birmingham, to start fresh somewhere that didn't remind her constantly of Tommy's absence. But she couldn't bring herself to leave, clinging to the belief that he might still return, that he might need to find her exactly where he'd left her. The most difficult moments came at random times, when she caught herself setting 2 plates at dinner, or when she heard a truck engine that sounded like Tommy's, or when Rex would suddenly perk up his ears and stare at the front door as if sensing something no human could detect. In the summer of 1979, Sheriff Coleman retired, and his replacement, Sheriff William Park, reviewed all outstanding cases. He spent one afternoon going through Tommy's file, but found nothing new to investigate. The case remained open but inactive, filed alphabetically between a cattle theft and a series of residential burglaries. As 1979 drew to a close, Tommy Calloway had been missing for 15 months. Martha had aged years in that time, her brown hair showing premature grey, her smile becoming increasingly rare. The community had gradually stopped asking about him, treating his disappearance as an unfortunate but resolved chapter in Millfield's history. What nobody knew was that answers lay waiting in the most unexpected place, buried not in the ground or hidden in some distant location, but in plain sight, wrapped in the mundane routines of their small-town life. The truth was patient, content to wait until the right moment revealed itself. Millfield, Alabama, August 12, 1994. The demolition of Briggs Auto Repair was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, 16 years after Tommy Calloway had last walked out of its front door. The property had been sold to a developer planning to build a small shopping center, and the old garage had sat empty since Mr. Briggs retired in 1987. City worker Miguel Santos was operating the excavator when his bucket struck something metallic buried beneath the concrete floor of the garage's back bay. The impact sent a jarring vibration through the machine, and Miguel shut off the engine to investigate what appeared to be a large piece of scrap metal. But as he and his crew cleared away chunks of broken concrete, they realized they weren't looking at random debris. Buried 3 feet beneath the garage floor was the rusted shell of a blue Chevrolet pickup truck, its license plate still barely readable through years of corrosion and dirt. Miguel recognized the significance immediately. Even after 16 years in Millfield, everyone still remembered the Calloway case. The young mechanic who'd simply vanished one September evening, leaving behind a wife and a mystery that had never been solved. Sheriff Park arrived within an hour, followed by state investigators and a forensics team from Montgomery. The area was cordoned off with yellow tape, and word spread through Millfield faster than smoke from a house fire. By afternoon, nearly 100 people had gathered on Highway 31, straining to see over the barriers and understand what was happening at the old garage. Martha, now 42 and remarried to a kind man named David Chen, who worked at the bank, felt her knees weaken when Sheriff Park appeared at her door. She'd spent 16 years building a new life, trying to forget the questions that had once consumed her. Seeing the sheriff's solemn expression brought everything rushing back. "We found Tommy's truck, Martha," he said gently, "and we're going to find out what happened to him." The excavation continued for 3 days. Working carefully around the vehicle, investigators uncovered a scene that told a story of deliberate concealment. The truck had been pushed into a pit that had been dug specifically to hide it, then covered with fresh concrete that matched the rest of the garage floor perfectly. Inside the truck's cab, forensics specialists found Tommy's wallet, still containing his driver's license, and $12 in cash. His work boots were on the passenger seat, along with a half-finished pack of Marlboro cigarettes and a receipt from Miller's Grocery dated September 14, 1978, the day he disappeared. But the most significant discovery was a small notebook wedged between the driver's seat and center console. The pages were water-damaged and difficult to read, but investigators could make out what appeared to be a list of names and dates, written in handwriting that didn't match Tommy's. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the state forensic anthropologist, carefully removed bone fragments from the truck bed, confirming what everyone had feared. Tommy Calloway had been murdered and his body disposed of, along with his vehicle. The condition of the remains suggested he'd been deceased since shortly after his disappearance. News of the discovery dominated local television coverage and made headlines in Birmingham newspapers. Reporters descended on Millfield, interviewing longtime residents and asking questions that forced people to remember details they'd pushed aside years earlier. Dale Morrison, now the owner of his own repair shop in Cullman, drove down to speak with investigators. After seeing the excavation site, he finally shared the memory that had nagged at him for 16 years, the stranger who'd asked specific questions about Tommy's schedule on the day he disappeared. "I can still see his face," Dale told Sheriff Park. "He was maybe 40, 45 years old, wearing work clothes but clean ones, like he wasn't really a working man. He had this way of asking questions that seemed casual, but now I realize he was gathering information." The notebook found in Tommy's truck contained more than just names and dates. Forensic analysis revealed fragments of what appeared to be financial records, amounts of money, locations, and coded references that suggested some kind of organized operation. As investigators worked to piece together the evidence, one name kept appearing in their research: Vincent "Vinny" Marcelli, a former construction foreman who'd worked on several projects in Jefferson County during the late 1970s. Marcelli had the skills to dig a pit and pour concrete, and according to employment records, he'd been working on a road project near Millfield in September 1978. But Vinny Marcelli had died in a car accident in 1986, taking whatever secrets he might have known to his grave. The investigation seemed poised to stall again, just as it had 16 years earlier. Then Sheriff Park received a phone call that changed everything. Millfield, Alabama, September 23, 1994. The call came from an unexpected source. Father Michael O'Brien of St. Patrick's Catholic Church in Bessemer, 25 miles south of Millfield. The elderly priest had been following news coverage of the discovery at Briggs Auto Repair, and something about the investigation had been troubling his conscience for weeks. "I need to speak with you about Vincent Marcelli," Father O'Brien told Sheriff Park over the phone. "There are things I learned in confession that I couldn't share while he was alive, but now, well, the circumstances have changed. Church doctrine typically protected the sanctity of confession even after death, but Father O'Brien had consulted with his bishop and determined that preventing further injustice outweighed his obligation to maintain silence. Marcelli had confessed to him multiple times in the years before his death, and his final confession had included details about Tommy Calloway's murder. According to Father O'Brien, Marcelli had been involved in an illegal gambling operation that extended across several counties in central Alabama. Tommy Calloway had witnessed something he shouldn't have, not through any criminal involvement of his own, but by pure chance while driving home from work on September 14, 1978. "Vincent told me that Tommy had seen them moving money at an old barn on Morse Road," the priest explained during his meeting with investigators. "Tommy didn't understand what he was seeing, but he recognized one of the men involved. Vincent said they couldn't take the risk that Tommy might eventually piece things together. The gambling operation had been run by a network of men who organized high-stakes poker games for wealthy businessmen and politicians. They moved their location frequently to avoid detection, and the barn on Morse Road had been one of their temporary sites. Tommy had driven past just as they were transferring large amounts of cash between vehicles. Marcelli's confession revealed that Tommy had been followed home that evening, then confronted in his own driveway. When he refused to promise his silence, insisting he didn't even understand what he'd seen, the decision was made to eliminate him as a potential threat. Vincent said Tommy kept asking what they were talking about, saying he just wanted to go inside and have dinner with his wife. Father O'Brien continued, his voice heavy with the weight of carrying such knowledge for so long. But they'd already decided he was a liability. The murder had been carried out by two men working under Marcelli's direction. Tommy was killed behind his house, his body placed in his own truck, and both were transported back to the auto garage, where Marcelli had legitimate access as a construction foreman, working on nearby road projects. The concrete work had been done over a weekend when the garage was closed, using equipment and materials from Marcelli's construction company. The operation was completed so professionally that even Mr. Briggs, who returned to work on Monday morning, never noticed that a section of his floor had been replaced. Father O'Brien produced a letter that Marcelli had given him shortly before his death in 1986, with instructions to open it only if the Calloway case was ever reopened. The letter contained names, dates, and locations that corroborated everything the priest had shared. Armed with this new information, investigators began tracking down the surviving members of the gambling operation. Most were now in their 60s and 70s, living quiet lives as respected members of their communities. But the evidence was overwhelming, and within 6 months, 5 men had been arrested and charged in connection with Tommy Calloway's murder. The trial became the biggest news story in Jefferson County history. Testimonies revealed the extent of the illegal gambling network and the climate of fear that had led to an innocent young man's death. Several defendants pleaded guilty in exchange for reduced sentences, while others maintained their innocence despite mounting evidence against them. Martha attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row and finally learning the truth about what had happened to her first husband. The randomness of his death, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, was both devastating and strangely comforting. Tommy hadn't chosen to leave her. He'd simply been unlucky enough to witness something that cost him his life. During the sentencing phase, Martha was allowed to address the court. She spoke not with anger, but with a quiet dignity that moved everyone in the courtroom. Tommy was a good man who worked hard and loved his family, she said. He didn't deserve to die, and I didn't deserve to spend 16 years wondering if I'd failed him somehow, but knowing the truth has finally allowed me to let him rest in peace. The case was officially closed in March 1995, 17 years after Tommy Calloway disappeared. He was buried in Millfield Cemetery, not far from the house where he'd planned to build a future with Martha. The inscription on his headstone read simply, "Beloved husband and son, the truth has set him free." The discovery at Briggs Auto Repair led to investigations in 3 other counties, uncovering additional crimes and corruption that had been hidden for decades. The gambling network was completely dismantled, and several public officials were forced to resign when their connections to the operation were revealed. For the people of Millfield, the resolution brought closure to a mystery that had haunted their community for nearly 2 decades, but it also served as a reminder of how violence could intrude into the most ordinary lives, and how the truth, no matter how long buried, has a way of eventually surfacing. Today, a small shopping center stands where Briggs Auto Repair once operated. Most visitors have no idea that beneath the parking lot lies the place where justice was finally served for a young mechanic who simply wanted to go home for dinner with his wife.